Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have William Peters. He is a licensed psychotherapist and he's the author of the book, At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better. There's an excerpt on that book on Kevin MD. William, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
So we'll get into your book and excerpt in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Yeah, when I look at how I got into being a researcher and a clinician focused on individuals who have these extraordinary end-of-life experiences around death and dying, particularly, it's a very personal journey for me because you don't grow up thinking you're going to work with people around death and dying. So I actually had a near-death experience at 17 years old. High-speed skiing accident, Squaw Valley, right outside Lake Tahoe, crushed my spine. And in that moment, I was catapulted away from my body. I was very peaceful, no real issues about pain at all. And I was moving through this beautiful universe. I could see planet Earth in the distance. And I had a life review up to my 17 years there. And then ran into this, and I mean that quite directly. I saw this light in the distance and I knew I was dying. At that moment, I realized I did not want to die. And I ended up, pleading with this source, which I call God, to come back. I came back, as you can tell, but I didn't think about that experience for 10 years. And, I think your viewers know this is a classic near-death experience, now well understood with a good deal of research and science in terms of validating that it happens under trauma and stress. So here I am with a spinal injury now, chronic pain, difficulty walking, and my life takes a completely different trajectory. I ended up going to Central and South America, working with underprivileged populations primarily. But it was there that I had my first exposure to, I call pre-modern cultures. And there, working with indigenous people, really got a sense for this notion that these people could move in and out of this human experience into other dimensions. Mm-hmm. And it matched what I knew in my near-death experience. So I was very open to it. But I returned home to the San Francisco Bay Area and work as a social worker in San Francisco. And the AIDS epidemic essentially breaks out in the late 80s, early 90s throughout San Francisco. And I'm a social worker in really kind of the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, a real Skid Row part of town. And here I am working with many young men who are dying of AIDS. And what they're telling me in my clinical office is that they're with their brothers who are dying. And keep in mind, every person that I was working with who had contracted HIV knew they had a death sentence. And so they would gather up as a community, often ostracized, and then they would come and see me for psycho-emotional support, and they would share these experiences, primarily something like this, which is the feature or the focus of my book, a shared death experience, essentially this. Here I am, I'm gathered around somebody who's dying. This is a group of people, and they say, I feel like I shared in this journey with the dying person into a benevolent afterlife. One experience in particular I'll share because it's so profound. This is a gentleman, Brad, he was kind of an elderly, older than most of the people in his community. So he would have been around many, many deaths and was quite adept at caring for the dying. He comes in one morning exhausted. And I say, Brad, what is going on? He said, well, last night Randy died. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. And he says, yeah, but it was so beautiful. And I said, beautiful, tell me. And he describes this experience where the brothers, as he calls them, the community of young men mostly, gathered around Randy's bread. And as Randy dies, he rises out of his body and he goes up through a cylinder of light and he looks back at all the caregivers there and he looks at them and says, thank you. Thank you for caring for me. And what Brad reported is he was younger, he was healthy, he was healed, and then he moved up that light and disappeared. So long story short, these experiences that I had first there, then another near-death experience with idiopathic thrombocytopenia in an intensive care unit. I floated above my body for a number of hours. And then a doctor came in, the hematologist came in the wee hours of the morning. He taps on my hand. Of course, he's tapping on a body that I don't even know is mine. It isn't until he calls out my name and says, Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters. And I realized, oh my gosh, that's me in the bed. And I then answer him. And as I answer him, I fill in my body. I literally went from the perspective of seeing this doctor from above, looking at his crown. And then as I talk to him, answer him, I'm looking at him through my eyes into his face. So this is another type of out-of-body experience, a near-death experience. And then I worked in hospice, a very progressive hospice in San Francisco, Zen Hospice Project. And it was there that I had a number of shared death experiences, one in particular with a gentleman named, we'll call him Ron. Ron is dying. He has been unresponsive for a couple weeks. I've been reading to him every afternoon that I'm there. Reason why is we know that hearing is the last sense door to go in a dying process. I'm reading to him. All of a sudden, I pop out of my body and I am suspended above my body and Ron's body that is prone in his bed. I look to my right and there is Ron. I see his face. I see him smiling. He's looking at me as if to say, check this out. Here we are, above our physical bodies down below, communicating up here. And I'm comfortable with this because I've had other experiences. I return to my body sometime later, and I discussed this with the supervisor on our ward, who I loved and felt very comfortable with. He'd been a veteran of hospice work. His name was Eric. And I said, Eric, this is my experience. It just happened. And it was the Zen Hospice Project. So he was very Buddhist. And he says, William, phenomena rolling by, let it go. And this is a very important comment by Eric, because this is kind of the casual dismissal of these very profound end-of-life experiences. So I would have many more of these experiences, but it wasn't until 2009 when I met Dr. Raymond Moody. And he, of course, is the primary researcher and then the person who brought the near-death experience into public consciousness with his 1975 book, Life After Life. Well, he's talking at a conference, and he's not talking about the near-death experience now. He's talking about the shared death experience. And when I hear that, I say, for the first time, I realize there is a name, a label for this experience that I've had many times. And I've had many clients, both, primarily when I was a social worker, who have had this. So when I hear this, I basically tell Raymond, I want to study this. I want to research this. I think I know how we can help people have this experience. And why would you want to have this experience? Well, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, Brad detailed the power of this experience. You have a sense that your deceased loved one is alive and well in a benevolent afterlife. You have a sense that you'll see them again. You have your relationship to death and dying is transformed from one of fear and anxiety to one of, wonder and curiosity and acceptance in a certain way. Like it's not something to be feared anymore. And then we notice, I notice as a grief and psychotherapist that people's grief processes are much different when they're able to welcome these experiences into their life, work with them, make their own meaning of them. But the key is for them to know that these are experiences that happen, that they're normal, and they're actually gifts. So, my book goes into 28 stories and clinical responses to them as well. Some have clinical responses, not all of them. Most of them are just stories, actually. But you'll see as I wind through how it is that these experiences are quite common and far more common than certainly our healthcare providers know.
So you mentioned that you specialize in grief and bereavement psychotherapy. Tell me how your shared death experience, how does that influence your counseling and practice?
Yeah, thank you. I think the most important influence of my own experiences with the shared death experience and the near-death experience is that I know these experiences are real. They are not, they are not neuroses, they are not hallucinations, they are not delusions, they are not bouts of psychoses. too often, my clients will come to me saying that they did not have a positive experience, particularly in a healthcare setting, or sometimes also with spiritual care, who doesn't understand what they went through. So they look at them as if to doubt. So the point being here is, if somebody has a shared death experience, they're with a loved one, they're going through a major loss. Yes, there's some stress for sure, but they realize that they've just had this experience that's so profound and so meaningful, and they want to share it. But they're also wondering, hey, am I, it's an altered state of sorts. Am I making this up? Well, that first interaction, especially with healthcare providers, is very important. And oftentimes what we see is that in our literature, people express feeling dismissed, discounted, and in some cases disparaged. And so this is why, as a clinician and in my work, I am very welcoming to people to explore these experiences. Now, of course, I'm going to do a mental status exam. I'm going to get a sense for, whether this person is perhaps, has some psycho-emotional issues that may be influencing their experience. But by and large, I don't find that in the people that come to see me. And so as a clinician, I'm both knowledgeable about these experiences. I help people assess, I affirm them, I help people integrate them in this way by deepening into their experience. And the integration process is a meaning-making experience. I don't have any, sense of what's really happening here. No religion or spiritual interpretation or cosmology. I work with the client to make sense of the experience for themselves, and then work through the transformations in their life that this type of experience usually beckons.
Now, you mentioned that there's some research surrounding the shared death experience. So what are some of the main studies that are out there about shared death?
Yeah, so my research institute, the one that I direct, which is the Shared Crossing Research Initiative, we published the first dedicated study on the shared death experience. It was published in December of 2021 in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. And what was interesting about this was the reviewers were almost giddy in their commentary, which, as you know, you don't get that from peer-reviewed articles or journals very often. But what we heard was one reviewer in particular said, "Thank you so much for doing this research. Those of us who work in palliative hospice care know that these experiences happen, but we've never been able to do a robust scholarly study." And my team is multidisciplinary. I'm a psychotherapist, so I'm the one who brings in most of the clients, or they're not clients usually. They come to me and then I vet them, and then they become research participants. We also have a medical director, Dr. Monica Williams. She's an ER physician. And we also have Dr. Michael Kinsella, and he's a PhD in religion and cognitive sciences. So we have this really broad-based team that can work with this process to instill that we have the integrity and the academic rigor necessary to produce a quality study, which we have. Our first study, the one just I mentioned, has 143 deeply analyzed cases. And so I created the first typology for the shared death experience. That's a longer discussion, but to keep in mind that the shared death experience can happen at bedside in about 1/3 of our cases, and 2/3, 64%, will happen remotely. So you can be doing your life somewhere else, and all of a sudden you can have this type of profound experience where you feel like you're sharing in this journey to a benevolent afterlife. And what that means, Kevin, in the most common feature is seeing the dying on this journey, and oftentimes seeing elevated non-human beings that they often call guides or angels or just elevated helpers in this process. And then, of course, you see deceased relatives about 13% of the time. So it's really this profound journey that they get to participate in that is very affirming to the experiencer.
We're talking to William Peters. He's a licensed psychotherapist, and he's the author of the book, At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better. William, what are some of the major takeaways that you want your readers to come away from after reading your book?
Yeah, I want my readers, and particularly those who work in healthcare and spiritual care, to know that these experiences do indeed happen, and that we need to assess for them as healthcare providers, I would like to get healthcare measures in to really ask, hey, did you have any exceptional or profound experiences around the death of your loved one? Because this opens the door for people to begin a really profound healing process, a transformational process as well around death. Rather than the typical response of pushing death away, these experiences actually invite curiosity about what is happening with this great event of human death. And generally speaking, the mission of the Shared Crossing Project is to transform people's relationship to death and dying through raising awareness about these experiences. And I always say the best way to, get information out about these experiences is to talk to your trusted loved ones, because when you hear a third party talk about it, even me, you might say, well, this guy, I don't know where he comes from. But these are so common, but people just don't share them. So I want readers to know that these are normal, healthy events and they're gifts, and talk about them. Let's bring these experiences, these deeply spiritual and meaningful experiences, into our living rooms, into our communities. Let's talk about these.
And my final question, we'll ask you for some pieces of advice and wisdom that you can leave with my clinician audience listening to this.
Yeah, I think the real advice I would say is get curious about the spiritual experiences that happen to our clients and patients at the end of life. So much of what we do in our healthcare professions across the board, me and mental health, is we look for things that are pathological or incorrect and try to resolve them. Well, I advocate for inquiring about these spiritual experiences that actually will yield better grief and bereavement processes and will generally lead to better overall health.
William, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.